Hello, my friends. Long time no see. It's been a whole 30 minutes. So, this session is Kaiju Deep Dive episode number 4, which talks about how to write kaiju themed fan poetry. So, this art form is my area of expertise. I actually teach poetry on a regular basis at the college level. And unfortunately, I've just accepted the fact that poetry is an art form that isn't as strongly appreciated as it used to be. And my goal in life in general is to help people enjoy it more, to help familiarize people with it. And one thing that I really have a strong appreciation for is writing kaiju fan poetry. And I'm going to just talk to you a little bit about it today. It's gonna be kinda similar to the fan fiction conversation. So you'll like, I have a PowerPoint ready to go for this as well. It's my inner teacher, being, festive. So Ellen's here, um, Igny's here. Good to see you guys. Ellen says this is actually a rotating topic in Creativity Weeks too. So on Kaiju Galaxy, the forum, we're doing these creativity themed weeks on the message board where people will be doing different exercises, following different prompts, kind of to encourage creativity. And we definitely are including poetry as being one of them. And today I'm going to be talking to you about a few strategies on like how to even begin writing kaiju poetry. And I'm also going to be writing you a short kaiju poem live here on the stream. So it'll be interesting. We'll just see. It's going to be interesting. I don't think I've really, no, I have written a poem live before, just not for my fellow kaiju fans. So we'll see how this goes. All right, so I'm going to do a share screen here really quickly and just bring up the slideshow that I have. Um, so when it comes to writing fan poetry, obviously the first thing that I want to establish is, well, what is fan poetry? What does it constitute? So essentially, if a person who writes it is essentially creating a scene or conveying some sort of a point based on an already existing universe established by a film, TV, comic, or book franchise. So the whole purpose of fan poetry is to help readers gain an insight in a particular character or event that's taken place already. Obviously, since this is poetry we're talking about, poetry is intended to be much more compact, succinct. It's not meant to be large and expansive like a piece of fan fiction, for example. All right. So this is a much smaller, contained piece of writing. And in many ways, that's what makes it a little bit more difficult because you have to essentially force yourself to be very concise in your conveying of a point that you're trying to make. All right. We're going to be talking about that here in a few minutes, like how to do that. But essentially, that is what fan poetry encapsulates. You may find other people with some slightly different definitions. That's totally fine. But as a poet myself, like this is how I would define it. It's very much like fan fiction, except you're really honing in on very specific scenes, or you're honing in on very specific themes that you want to convey. Okay. Now, obviously, much like with fan fiction, one thought process that fan poets have to go through is they have to think about like what existing franchises they want their poems to be an extension of. So would that be Godzilla, Gamera, Ultraman, so on and so forth. All right. Now, what really intimidates a lot of people is that a lot of people assume that their poems have to be in some sort of form, that it has to be a sonnet or so on and so forth. Your poetry does not have to be in a form if you don't want it to be. It can be free verse, and free verse means that your poem will take whatever form it wants. It doesn't have to have any type of conforming qualities to pre-existing like formats. All right, it can be however you want it. You can have a poem that is 20 lines long with like 4 stanzas of 4 lines or whatever, or 5 lines, or I can't add today. um, you can have it be something very small. It can be 10 lines. It doesn't have to be lengthy. Okay. So, my personal favorite forms to write in are haiku forms and tanka forms, and I'm going to be talking to you about those toward the end of the stream because I'm going to be showing you. Well, I'm going to be writing a poem live for you, which should be fun, hopefully. But I encourage you, like if you are a person who wants to look into different poetic forms, I would encourage you do some research because you might find one that's very interesting. My personal favorite is tanka poems. Those are 5-line poems. They're not as short as haikus, but they also keep things very compact and specific. And but it's also challenging because it forces me to write something within the confines of 5 lines. Okay. But again, I would recommend doing research on any other poetic forms. If you want to have a one-on-one conversation with me about these different forms or writing poetry in general, I will talk your head off because I love poetry. It's very dear to me. So moving forward, when it comes to thinking about how to begin writing kaiju fan poetry, one, obviously, much like fan fiction, my big suggestion would be read poetry by other poets, especially monster genre poetry. Right now on the Kaiju Galaxy main website, if you go to kaijugalaxy.wordpress.com, my dear friend Alyssa Mitchell has a poem that's published on that site that's themed around Kiru, Mechagodzilla from the Kiru saga. A very beautiful poem. And additionally, like if you look at my deviant art from like ages ago, I do write some kaiju themed poetry, but it's been a long while since I've written a kaiju themed poem. So in this stream, you'll see me write a kaiju themed poem for the first time in years. All right, so Igni asks, are poems that don't exactly involve any kaiju related things acceptable? For the Kaiju Galaxy website, for that to publication that I proposed, it has to be kaiju themed for sure. Unless you might be referring to something different, I might ask you to clarify that question a little bit more. But on Kaiju Galaxy itself, like the forum, we do. I can't remember. Ellen, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think we have a section for general poetry. If not, we might include one. So we could do that. But like, answer that. It's a supplemental question that I asked, and I can get back with you on that. But some obviously going back to the slide here, reading other poetry by other poets definitely is helpful. You'll quickly gravitate to people who have like specific styles that really intrigue you. For me, like I read a lot of poems by poets like Meg Day, Robert Fanning, who was one of my mentors. Um, I really enjoy their work because they have helped shape my own work. Ellen did say that we do have a kaiju and general poetry section. So, Igni, if you do want to write non-kaiju themed poems and post them on Kaiju Galaxy, there is a space for you to do that for sure. Another reason to join the forum. P.S. Everybody, if you've not joined it yet. So the second step when it comes to framing your thought process for doing kaiju themed poetry would be determining, of course, what franchise you want your this should say poetry, not story. Can you tell that I adapted my PowerPoint? Poetry to connect with. All right. So do you want it to be Gamera, so on and so forth? What what era for step 3 do you want it to connect with? So on and so forth. Do you want it to be Heisei era, Monsterverse? Toward the end of this presentation, the poem that I'm going to be writing is going to be based on the Monsterverse. So it's going to be something relatively recent. So you'll be able to, I mean, if you've seen Godzilla King of the Monsters, you'll be able to develop an understanding of that, hopefully. Last but not least, when it comes to framing your thought process, you're going to want to begin structuring some notes by asking yourself questions of like what kaiju or moment do I want my poem to focus on? What deeper understanding of the character do I want the poem to convey? The reason why I pose these two questions is because if you go into poem writing so open-ended and abstract that you really have no basis, it's going to be very difficult to write. By asking yourself these key questions, you're going to be able to help yourself generate some ideas, which in turn, at the end of the day, is going to be very, very easy for you. It's going to make it a lot more convenient. Much like yesterday, my lips are ridiculously chapped, and I don't know why. You would think with how humid it is outside here right now, it would be definitely, they would be not chapped. So those are the questions to ask prior, like this is prior to even starting a poem, like, because you want to start getting yourself in the thought process of doing that. Much like I was saying in my fan fiction stream, in order to write poetry, you're definitely going to want to start framing your thought process and identifying yourself as a poet, even if you've never written a poem before. If you identify yourself that way, like you'll start kind of imbuing yourself with a little bit more confidence and authority and actually writing in this type of form. All right. So it's, I mean, you're not going to get the hang of it right off the bat. It's going to take some time to do that, but you'll get the hang of it. You'll get the hang of it. So, um, going on to the next slide, here are some things that you want to avoid when doing kaiju themed poetry. Um, Bullet point number 1, don't get distracted by form. Kind of going back to what I was talking about before. Some people get so freaked out about form that they don't end up writing their poems because they worry that it needs to have like this predetermined shape for the audience. It doesn't have to have a predetermined shape. If you want to write something that is in free verse that doesn't conform to form, that's totally okay. I've seen people write prose poetry. That's poetry that takes on more of a story-esque format, like blocks of text, not necessarily lines and stanzas. You can do that as well if that's what you prefer. The next one is super important. Avoid telling, show instead. Sensory details are important. So poetry largely is painting pictures with words in a way, or sculpting with words. So you're going to want to use your 5 senses to help your audience visualize something, or hear something, taste something, feel something. Um, what did I miss a sense? I can't remember if I missed a sense. I can't remember if I went through all five of them or not. But your senses are like your first threshold to help your audience experience what you're writing about. All right. That can be a little bit challenging. So we're going to be talking about different things related to that. All right. Now, don't include, like with fan fiction, don't include too many kaiju, don't include too many characters, because again, that'll get very overwhelming. If you're writing a short poem, if you have a bunch of kaiju in it, that's going to get really confusing, not only for you, but it's only also going to get confusing for the audience. And of course, you want to avoid any type of confusion, because if you turn off your reader, then they're going to end up not reading the rest of your work, and it's not going to resonate with people. The next one, make sure that it's clear to the audience who is doing the speaking in the poem. All right, this is an odd one that I didn't really state for the fan fiction one, because I think it's a little bit more applicable with poetry. So who is doing the speaking? Is it the kaiju who's doing the speaking? Is it a persona? Is it a spectator? In the poem that I'm going to be writing for you in a little bit, it'll be written from the perspective of a spectator. All right. So someone witnessing a moment that happened in Godzilla King of the Monsters. But if you angle it like that, it's going to make it a lot easier for the audience to understand where you're going, because a lot of people, if they're not really familiar with reading poetry, if they don't have that context, then they might not know really what to do with the images or the messages or themes conveyed to them. Igni, yes, you can email that draft to me. I would love to look at it. So Igni, you use haiku or incantations for D&D. That's really cool. Well, when I show you tankas, that might be an intriguing poetic form for you too. So we'll have a conversation about that. I could go on for 10 streams about how much I love tanka poems, because they're just so fun to write. So the next one, avoid stating the obvious. Poetry is meant to be a little bit suspenseful. Mostly because, like, It's easy to be obvious in poems because they're very short, so you may be tempted to just write some very self-explanatory statements, okay? Like if I were writing a poem and I said something to the effect of Mothra's beautiful wings, like, duh, Mothra's wings are beautiful, of course. Why would I write that her wings are beautiful when I could write something that shows it a little bit more interestingly using sensory details, or something that might be a little bit more suspenseful, um, like I could say something like, "Gossamer curtains of color dipped beneath the clouds." Mothra's wings being like gossamer curtains, but being full of color. I could take it a little bit more specific and actually name colors or make comparisons, right? To kind of illustrate the point that I'm making, instead of just saying that something is beautiful. Avoid words like beautiful, avoid words like big, gigantic, avoid the word pretty, because those words have been used so much that they've lost their meaning, and people aren't going to really understand what you're trying to say if they've been exposed to it, if they've been inundated with it. Okay. Avoid cliche concepts or statements. So if I were to write a poem, like here's an example of a cliche. If I were to write a love poem and I were to say, love is a rose, it has thorns, but it's still beautiful. Like, that is a very, very glaring cliche, because that is an image that's been overused so much over the years. So you want to avoid ones like that, because it's going to just annoy the audience, because they're like, I mean, I've seen that before. Like, duh, Um, so like you would definitely want to kind of use a different image to replace that. Like, obviously, one common thing that I see in kaiju themed poetry, people will write poems and establish the size of a kaiju. Like like Godzilla was so large that he was big. He was just bigger than a skyscraper. Very, very self-explanatory image, right? Whereas you could say something a little bit more succinctly by saying, Godzilla's shadow form loomed against the horizon in in conjunction with the mountain tops in the distance. So that's kind of you taking Godzilla's image and placing him in a backdrop against mountain tops, like his form being close enough where he seems to look as though he is the same height as the mountains in the background. Like, it kind of gives the audience some sort of like depth perception of what you're trying to describe. Does that make sense? So that's something that you're going to want to do. You want to avoid any type of cliche descriptions that just don't really do anything for the audience. All right. So I'm realizing that I've already been talking for like 13 minutes. um, so getting your ideas on paper. This is my last slide for this, and then I'm going to show you how to write a kaiju poem. So follow the steps that I've established on the prior slides with how to begin, because that's framing your thoughts. Number 2, open up a Word document and begin jotting down some notes. You may want to jot down what kaiju you want to write about, the moment in the films that you want to identify, or perhaps even an original concept that's not tied to the films. Okay. Number 3, jot down some sensory images that describe the kaiju, the setting, so on and so forth. Like, maybe like just words or phrases that help you visualize what's happening in that moment so you can illustrate it. Number 4, a theme or message that you may want your poem to convey. Note, a poem doesn't always have to have a theme or message necessarily. I like to include a theme or message because it makes it a little bit easier to write. It kind of gives me some sort of anchor for my poem, so I can like circulate my entire poem around it, if that makes sense. And then last but not least, start weaving together the ideas, like the words in the form of lines or even stanzas. Your poem doesn't have to necessarily have stanzas. It can be just like one like block of lines. That's entirely fine. It's really up to you on how you exercise your judgment. Okay. Um, Ellen says that Evernote is a pretty good idea for poetry ideas, or a pretty good thing for poetry ideas. I would definitely agree. I would definitely agree with that. All right. my friends. Are we ready for the defining moment of the stream that hopefully won't go awry? I'm going to write a poem live for you. All right, so I'm going to share I'm going to do another share screen. Let's hope we can do this in 10 minutes. So I'm going to open up a Word document here. So I have this Word document, and I'm going to be doing a fan poem. All right. So the first thing that I want to do is identify who the kaiju is that I'm going to be writing about. As you can probably imagine, the one that I'm selecting is Mothra. All right. What version of Mothra, you ask? The MonsterVerse version of Mothra. Obviously from the film. It's down. I would love if I could italicize this. There we go. Godzilla, King of the Monsters. Film titles always get italicized. Okay, now the scene, just to kind of help my note-taking process for this. Gosh, I really hate Microsoft Word sometimes. Ickney, what do you mean? You thought that I said to avoid cliches? Did I say something that was cliche? Let's see. So for the scene specifically, one of my favorite scenes in Godzilla King of the Monsters would be the scene that is where like they're on the ocean where Castle Bravo is, like that kind of like that ocean tower where they're like coordinating like all of their like monster monitoring. I love the scene where Mothra descends or like us kind of like comes through the clouds. Mothra's entrance. Okay. Igny's like choosing Mothra. If it were a cliche, then it would be me just focusing on Mothra's big, Mothra's pretty. Like if it were just like very boring, straightforward statements like that, then I would characterize that as cliche. But I'm basically just going to be using a poem to help describe this moment from a spectator's point of view. So that character, for example, the character that I can't remember his name, it's Vera Farmiga's husband in the film. He's kind of a forgettable character in my opinion, and I feel horrible for saying that. But he literally is out on the landing platform, like the airstrip, and he sees Mothra come through the clouds, and he's like in awe of the experience, right? So I want to write this poem from his perspective. So that establishes the persona. So it is from a human perspective, witnessing Mothra's entrance. All right. Now, if I wanted to get a little bit more intricate and if I wanted to help myself out a little bit more in writing this poem, I might go as far as maybe copying and pasting an image of that actual scene taken from the movie. That way I can look at it. Okay. So let's see here. Next, I would probably want to incorporate a little bit of like idea of what form. So I'm going to write this poem as a tanka. So a tanka is a 5-line poem, and each line has different syllable lengths. So the syllable structure goes 5 syllables, 7, 5, and then the last 2 lines are 7 syllables. I'm going to keep track of that while I write this. It gives a very convenient way for me to keep my thoughts in a specific box, if that makes sense. So if I were to write the first line, I would probably want to introduce this as being, say, like kind of like setting the stage for it, right? So line number 1, I would probably think of some images. So like I'm thinking of, and I could even write these down, but for the sake of time, I'm not going to. I could think of like the stormy atmosphere, like the sky being black. So if I were to write my first line, I would say maybe the storm quakes Storm quakes, that's 3 syllables. Um, the storm quakes skyward. Okay, so that kind of sets the stage a little bit. The verb quakes suggests that it's like thundering, right? Like it's kind of like this large storm that's really kind of rustling people to their core. Because in the film, it was a storm that Ghidorah was generating. It was a giant hurricane, right? So the storm quakes skyward. Let's see. For the second line, which is a little bit longer, I like to use transitions. So I'm going to start with the word and the deluge, so like the rainfall. I would recommend using some like interesting wording too to kind of change things up. So, and the deluge, that's 4 syllables. Okay. Um, baptizes, and the deluge baptizes everything it. Let's see. Let's see. Let's see. The third line is always difficult because it condenses it a little bit more again. So the storm quakes skyward as the deluge. I'm going to put switch and as the deluge baptizes the oceans, like the, let's see, the ocean, something the ocean. Let me think. The churning ocean. There we go. So I want to really capture the moment, like where like that beam of light where Mothra starts to appear shows. All right. So the storm quakes skyward as the deluge baptizes the churning ocean. Let's see. Behind clouds, behind the clouds, a spark springs. Behind the clouds, a spark springs. That's 7 syllables. So springs, comma, and let's see. Do I want to use the word and? Maybe not. So behind the clouds, a spark springs in the storm. Well, like see, and grows. I'm going to put grows after that. Grows until the storm is torn. Ooh, okay. Until the storm is torn. Notice that internal rhyme there. So that kind of like adds in a little bit of rhythmic quality to it that might draw the audience in a little bit more. Now, I like honestly, this could be the beginning of a much larger poem. All right. The storm quakes skyward as the deluge baptizes as a churning ocean. I'll put a churning ocean. So I used the a little bit earlier. Behind the clouds, a spark springs, grows. I'll say, then grows. That kind of adds on 1 extra syllable, but I don't care. It doesn't have to be completely conforming. A spark springs, then grows until the storm is torn. And then if I were to write a next stanza, I would probably write that about like Mothra descending or like Mothra coming down, like in a torrential like beam of light in her bioluminescence. So like I would want to like capitalize on like the sublime quality of a small human witnessing the vastness of her appearing like that. Okay. So that's an idea of how you would start writing a kaiju fan poem. Okay. So I hope that you may have found that a little bit helpful. So unfortunately, we've come close to the end of this stream. I probably should have scheduled this one a little bit longer, but I just wanted to help illustrate like the thought process behind creating a kaiju fan poem. So what I'm going to do now that I'm feeling super creative later today, I'm going to finish this poem and post it just for fun. That way everyone can see like the result of it. So anyway, I really appreciate you all joining me for this short session. If you want, I would recommend giving a try for this. It might be fun for you to do. If you want, like you can write a tanka poem like I just showed you, or you can even write a haiku. Haiku poems are 3 lines, 5 syllables for the first, 7 for the second, 5 for the last. Like if you want to start short and specific, that might be the easiest way for you to go. Anyway, I will see you for the creating your own kaiju theme if you come to that. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.